On this week's episode of the Father Dynasty Podcast, I will talk the perfect number of kids, Week 6 news and notes, and the biggest fantasy surprises. So without further ado, what is up, everybody? Welcome to yet another episode of the Father Dynasty Podcast. I'm your fatherly host, Chew, here in the manhole, here to talk fatherhood, fantasy football, and everything in between. And with me this week is nobody. Going in solo, going to recap a little bit of week 6. But first, I do want to highlight a Dynasty Daddy of the Week. This was a segment that I had semi-released last week when I didn't have an episode. Highlighted Jeff Bell, for whom J Bell tolls on Twitter, for a great tweet that he had and kind of sparked a fatherhood type conversation and question. But two I have this week, good buddies, guys I grew up with, Tyler Daly and Trevor Stewart, both of which have been on the podcast. Tyler, who is the most tenured, the most frequent guest here on the podcast, and Trevor, he was on episode 50. If you want to crawl back in the archives there, they both are expecting, so very excited for them. For Tyler and for his wife Megan, who she was actually on episode 48. If you want to crawl back and check that one out, that will be their second. And then Trevor and his wife Sterling, they will be there first, and they live here in the same town that I do, same city that I do. So very excited for both of them. So huge shout out to them. Of course, Tyler, his Twitter is at tdaily11. Trevor is not on Twitter, but he's been my buddy since diapers. So excited for both of those guys, for both of their families, and wanted to shout them out. But it does bring up a good question, one that I'm sure any current parent or, prospective parent has thought of before. What is the ideal number of kids? And I'm sure this is influenced by, when you were growing up yourself, how many siblings do you have? Does that become the ideal number? Or if you feel like however many you grew up with is too many, maybe one less than that. So I'm sure a lot of that is influencing that, maybe given your situation, whether it be, the work-life balance, the house you're in, where you live, what your lifestyle is like. A number of different factors I'm sure go into that process. So my wife and I had ended up deciding on just the one, thought about two, possibly, went back and forth on it, and had ended up just deciding on one. He'll actually be 5 here in the coming weeks. I think it's about 3 weeks now. And this is, of course, being recorded during Monday Night Football, not watching the game as at this specific moment. But we'll be talking about Dak actually here a little bit later. And to talk about a couple of other people in the fantasy space who were answering this question of what's the ideal number of kids, other parents and dads in the space. The prevailing number is 2, or about 2. I didn't get anyone that said 1. Usually it was either 2 or more. And the logic from a lot of them, just to shout out a couple of people here. So I've got, and this is using Twitter handles, at Godfather League, he was talking about 2+. So the idea is the siblings can be a source of friendship and emotional support. He has a boy and a girl at the moment. Smoky Hell NFL has 2, or 2 is the number, and the second is actually on the way. So it has a boy and there's another one on the way. At FF Chalmers, 2 is the ideal number, but has one right now. So, I guess the second one is in the plans there. At FF the At-Home Dad, 2, he has twin boys. Let's see, we've got at Norton 0723, 2 is ideal. He's got 2 boys. And then last but not least, at Byron Cobalt, he says approximately 3.5 is typically ideal. And the logic with him there was, you never wish you didn't have one of them. So once you have a kid, it's, you love every one of them. So you need a good reason to stop. And he was talking about, I think once you reach the point where there's, health or maybe a lack of time that you can give to each and every child that you have, maybe is more the point or the reason of why you'd want to stop, which I think makes sense. You want to make sure you do have, the capacity in whatever way that may mean to be able to, appreciate and love all your kids as much the same as it possibly can be. I know every kid's different personalities, different, ways to bond, that kind of thing. So it's not all apples to apples necessarily, but at least apples to oranges. Well, very good to know. Sounds like 2 is the prevailing number, at least 2. And very curious to hear what you all think out there in the YouTube universe and the fantasy universe. Is 2 the number? Is it less? Is it more? Uh, at least based on this very small sample size, I'm in the minority with the having the 1, and I myself have 1 brother, so I came up in a 2-kid household. But curious to hear your thoughts on that one. But next up, I will talk about some of the news and notes from Week 6's games, and that is before the Monday Night Football game. So this is the FF Perspective. So Week 6, it gave us a slew of injuries. It gave us a couple of losses that were a bit surprising, as I'm sure every week does, and also leaves us with 1 winless team. And they are, of course, emblazoned all over my wall and on the back of this hat. And I didn't turn this hat around because of shame. It's just stylistically it makes more sense. At least my wife says so. So running through these games here. So the first game of the week, it was the Broncos going down by the hands of the Chiefs, 8-19. So Broncos still have 1 win. Couldn't crack 200 yards of offense, 3 turnovers. Jerry Jeudy, after getting shit talked by Agent 89, my guy, Steve Smith, 3 receptions for 14 yards. Not to speak too ill of Jerry Jeudy, because also just, again, like I said, didn't crack 200 yards of offense for the Broncos. The Broncos offense as a whole was not tremendously inspiring. The Chiefs defense, was pretty suffocating. Chiefs, of course, climbed to 5-1. Isaiah Pacheco continues to have a pretty strong fantasy season. I'd seen a tweet earlier, I believe it was today, talking about his share of the run snaps, and it's grown week over week to the point that it has now. He's worked well in both phases, both as a runner and as a pass catcher. So great, love to see that. Travis Kelce cracks over 100 yards, and that actually, my buddy Tyler, who I mentioned as a Dynasty Daddy of the Week, that has not happened too much this year in terms of a tight end getting over 100 receiving yards. So Kelce getting back to his same old ways. Jumping over to the next game, we had the Ravens and the Titans over in London, and Ravens beating the Titans 24-16. Ravens climbing to 4-2. Lamar Jackson led the team in rushing. Not a tremendous shock there. Zay Flowers had the only receiving touchdown there. And, I mean, the Ravens had 6 sacks. Unbelievable. And I do mean the Ravens caused 6 sacks, not allowed Lamar Jackson to get sacked 6 times. Big reason for that was Titans falling to 2-4. Tannehill did leave with an injury, which TBD on that one. It sounds like he could be out for a little bit. Malik Willis stepped in and didn't do tremendously well, I will say. But we did have Derrick Henry getting almost 100 rushing yards. You had Tajay Spears having a tremendous catch and run. I think it was just shy of 50 yards. Tremendous play there. So overall, there's some things on the Titans to look forward to. But even with a healthy Ryan Tannehill, I think it has not been tremendously inspiring. DeAndre Hopkins has not had a tremendous season. Again, although going to the Tennessee Titans offense, I don't know what he expected, honestly, by way of wins or by way of receiving production. And that has been with Treylon Burks largely absent for this season to this point. All right, this is going to be a tough one. So jumping over to the Panthers and the Dolphins. The Dolphins double the Panthers score, beat them 42-21. Panthers remain a winless 0-6. Chuba Hubbard steps in the stead of Miles Sanders, getting 90 yards and 1 touchdown. A strong showing, working again in both phases, much like Isaiah Pacheco with the rushing and the receiving. Adam Thielen continues to absolutely impress. 11 receptions, 115 yards, and a touchdown. Unbelievable. And more so, 0 turnovers for the Panthers. A big, big shock. But if the other team is going to be putting up 42, it's kind of tough to compete with that. And you've got the Dolphins rising to 5-1, Tua getting 3 touchdowns. Raheem Mostert, the RB2 on the year, only behind Christian McCaffrey, who I will talk about a little bit later. Mostert getting over 130 scrimmage yards, 3 touchdowns. Tyreek Hill producing at an unbelievable level, getting 163 yards and a touchdown. And Tua was not sacked a single time. So again, when you look at it from that perspective, no turnovers from the Panthers and no sacks allowed by the Dolphins allows for a lot of points, and sure as hell was. But Panthers falling again to 0-6. Jumping over to the Saints and the Texans beating the Saints 20-13. Kamara, since he's been back, he's been a PPR monster, getting over 100 yards on 26 touches. The name of the game for him thus far has been volume, volume, volume. And I've loved to see it. He was out for a couple of games, of course, not health related, related to his an altercation that he had outside of the game of football. But he seems to be back in true form. Again, when you get this kind of volume that he's getting to this point, efficiency is not necessarily a huge concern. And especially, as I said, in PPR, if he's getting enough receptions, it's fine. He doesn't even need to get touchdowns. He's getting the Lamar Miller treatment of back in his earlier Texans days when he just got so much volume, it really didn't matter. Speaking of Texans, so both of these teams are end up 3-3 after this week. CJ Stroud, again, having a tremendous rookie season, threw 2 touchdowns, and shockingly enough, Singletary actually outproduced Dameon Pierce. So something that we've been kind of watching throughout the season. Singletary was, of course, a notable add in that backfield for the Houston Texans, as one assumed that Dameon Pierce, after recovering from his injury from last season, would resume the more or less workhorse role, or at least be a clear 1A to Devin Singletary's 1B. And again, Pierce has gotten steady volume, but Singletary has been eating away at that a little bit, and we'll see how that continues throughout the season. Jumping over to the Commanders and Falcons. Commanders beating the Falcons 24-16. Commanders now 3-3. Falcons now 3-3. The Commanders not even getting 200 total yards, but Sam Howell getting 3 passing touchdowns. Brian Robinson leading the Commanders in rushing. No surprise there. Bigger surprise, though, is 31 rushing yards. Tough to win if you do that, but they did it anyway. At the hands of Sam Howell, the arm of Sam Howell. And, this Commanders team, they're an interesting one this year. Again, I really thought this was going to be a turnaround. I was a firm believer in Sam Howell coming out of UNC. Glad he's getting this chance for the Commanders. Again, he has a bevy of weapons when it comes to just the sheer depth of McLaurin, Dotson, Samuel. He's got his buddy from college, De'Ami Brown. He's got Logan Thomas. He's got a couple other tight end depth players there. And also, of course, has the Brian Robinson, and who I hoped was going to be the J.D. McKissick reincarnated in Antonio Gibson, but, hasn't quite happened, but has built a little bit. We'll see how that goes. The disappointing part of this game here, Falcons, ending up 3-3, just as the Commanders did. Ritter, throwing 3 interceptions, looking rough, and decision-making was just not in full effect on Sunday. Pitts and Jonnu, so Kyle Pitts and Jonnu Smith did, however, each get a touchdown. Love to see that. And Drake London eclipsed 100 receiving yards. So the production was there from the standpoint of fantasy for each of those, Kyle Pitts, Jonnu Smith, and Drake London. However, we did see 3 picks from Desmond Ritter, and I would have to believe a mounting, disbelief and lack of faith in Ritter as the future quarterback for this Falcons team. I was never really a big believer in Ritter. I've not so famously, because this podcast is not very big, always referred to him as the guy that Alec Pierce made look good at Cincinnati. It's a long nickname, but he always seemed to me like an Alex Smith light. And I know Alex Smith, strong competitor in college, again, before and even after his severe injury, leg injury that he had in the NFL. Pretty steady, good dual threat guy. Ritter, he's shown he has that rushing ability, and of course has put up some pretty good yardage here, but decision making has not been tremendous. And He, of course, is surrounded by a number of weapons, as I mentioned. And what I hadn't even mentioned yet is, of course, Bijan Robinson. But hopefully the Falcons can turn it around. Of course, they are in my Panthers NFC South. So in a way, I hope they don't. But it's not one of the better divisions here in the NFL. Jumping over to the Colts and the Jaguars. So the Colts falling to the Jaguars, 20-37, high scoring game. Colts finishing out 3-3 after this one. 4 total turnovers, with Gardner Minshew throwing 3 picks. And this was some news that came out today. It sounds like Anthony Richardson, who, of course, he was out with a shoulder injury, I believe, and Minshew was starting. There's a possibility that Anthony Richardson could be out the rest of the season with some shoulder surgery that they would have to be doing in the next week or so. Big concern there. Anthony Richardson, my belief was, and I think still is, the best quarterback coming out of that class. I think at this point there's that battle between he and CJ Stroud. Certainly from a dynasty or fantasy perspective, I think Anthony Richardson is the clear better quarterback there. I don't know that many would argue with that, but I think to this point, seeing him string together enough healthy games where he can have that rushing upside, certainly scoring rushing touchdowns, and have it be a sustainable thing, he hasn't quite proven that yet. And again, I mean, the tantalizing upside of him is that he's essentially built like Derrick Henry, can throw it a country mile, and can do a standing backflip. The best way I know how to summarize Anthony Richardson, seen largely as a raw prospect, being younger and not having as many snaps as either Bryce Young or C.J. Stroud. But hoping he gets back healthy. If he is in fact out the rest of the season, certainly hope that they in Indy continue to build up that offensive line, get him more weapons, and of course, Anthony Richardson comes back happy and healthy next season. And another shocking development there in Indy, this would be Jonathan Taylor's, I believe, second game back since being let off of the injured reserve. And Zach Moss and Jonathan Taylor having about equal touches. So still not Zach Moss's backfield, but it's tough to even figure out a 1A and 1B in this situation. It's a pretty clear just 1A and 1A. And curious to see how that shakes out, as Jonathan Taylor was, of course, given a nice contract. And if I remember correctly, Zach Moss is making a 14th of what Jonathan Taylor is. Just saying. And the Jaguars, jumping over to that, Evan Ingram, I believe, leading the team with receptions, getting 7 receptions, 41 yards, a strong PPR play for tight end, as he always has been this season and last season for the Jaguars. And Christian Kirk actually leading the team in yards with 49 yards. Again, not a tremendous amount of single player production when it comes to receiving there. But of course, the Jaguars able to irk one out there with 17 points over the Colts. Jumping over to the Seattle Seahawks losing to the Cincinnati Bengals 13-17. The Seahawks at 3-2. Of course, they've already had a bye, which is the not having that 6th game there yet. Geno Smith having an uncharacteristic, inefficient game, having no touchdowns and 2 interceptions. And of course, Kenneth Walker leaving that game with 1 touchdown. The Bengals climbing to 3-3 after a tough start to the season. Joe Burrow, less than 200 yards, but again, leaving with the win. I think that's the most important thing there. And Andre Yosevash, I believe I said his name correctly. My buddy Jake and longtime guest on the podcast here pointed me out to him, that Princeton stud wide receiver, got his first touchdown. I love to see it, especially amidst plenty of other tremendous pass catchers there in Cincinnati. So I love to see him getting some work there. So jumping over to the next game. So my wife's favorite team, the Vikings, went out and beat the Bears 19-13. So the Vikings now 2-4, and this is the first game without Justin Jefferson. So he is, of course, out and out for many weeks at this point. We were going to see, is it going to be Addison stepping up as the rookie? Is it going to be KJ Osborne stepping up as the steady veteran? You, of course, have TJ Hawkinson as a monster pass catcher who they acquired last season. But Addison getting the touchdown, stepping up in a major way. The Bears falling to 1-5. And more importantly, Fields getting injured in the game. So you have Tyson Bagent, the undrafted rookie quarterback out of Shepherd University. he stepped in. He got a rushing touchdown. He did get a pick as well, but nets out okay for fantasy, I suppose. And you have DJ Moore being the receiving yards leader at 51 yards. Very curious to monitor this as the Bears now 1-5, of course. And I mentioned the winless Panthers. The Bears do have that Panthers pick when the Panthers went to pursue Bryce Young. So at this point, the Bears, now have the first overall pick, which is from the Panthers, and the Bears are 1-5, so have another, top 5 or so pick. So the way this is trending, if Fields ends up being out for a couple of weeks, or stays in, but of course the Bears keep losing. This is interesting because, what are they going to do with Fields going forward? What are they going to do with both of those very, very early first-round picks? Very curious to see how that shakes out. Jumping over to the next game, the San Francisco 49ers narrowly falling to the Cleveland Browns, 17-19. This is the P.J. Walker-led Cleveland Browns, as Deshaun Watson was out with his shoulder injury. P.J. Walker, former Panther, former Temple University grad, didn't do too well in terms of efficiency. He, of course, no touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Not quite in the same way as Ritter, but there's decision making was questionable at a certain couple of points, and I think it could have actually been worse than just those 2 interceptions. But thankfully, Jerome Ford and Kareem Hunt, a very good 1-2 punch when it came to churning that clock and managing the game pretty well. Ford, of course, being the clear RB1 there. And Amari Cooper, on a mere 4 receptions, getting a shade over 100 yards receiving. I did watch a bit of this game, specifically one very nice catch on the sideline from what looked like a bit of a Hail Mary pass from P.J. Walker. But jumping over to the 49ers, this is their first loss on the season, and it was from a stingy defense in the Cleveland Browns. The Browns absolutely harassed Purdy throughout the game. Again, of what I watched of this game, it was tough sledding for him for sure. A bigger hurdle that I think they're going to have to face that they did in this game and going forward. Christian McCaffrey looked really uncomfortable on that sideline at a number of points. It sounded like an oblique injury that he ended up going back into the locker room for, and they had Elijah Mitchell and Jordan Mason to step in. Deebo Samuel also got injured. We will see how both of those pan out. Of course, a big piece of what the 49ers do is having so many different weapons that can generate so much yards after the catch. Brock Purdy being able to, quickly get the ball out of his hands, being a good decision maker. So hopefully one or both of those guys will be able to be back. If not, I do think the combination of Elijah Mitchell and Jordan Mason, I think will do pretty well. Jordan Mason going ahead and filling in well and getting a touchdown. And in terms of wide receivers or pass catchers, I would say you do have George Kittle, of course, a Purdy favorite, as he had a 3-touchdown game. I believe it was in the prior week, week 5. And you also have, Brandon Ayuk and a number of other guys that I think can step up, any given Sunday type of mentality, and I think can do pretty well for that team. Jumping over to the Patriots and Raiders, the Raiders beating the Patriots 21-17. Patriots are tough to watch this year, falling to 1-5. Mac Jones sacked 4 times, not pulled, despite how the previous couple of games went with Bailey Zappi stepping in. And he had no touchdowns and 1 interception. Kendrick Bourne, just, a best ball darling, I would say. Probably a pretty cheap guy that people got in best ball, having 10 receptions and 89 yards. An interesting piece of this Patriots offense, you have Bill O'Brien stepping in, a true offensive mind, as compared to a Matt Patricia or, a defensive mind stepping in as the OC. Confused by that, very much so. Ramondre Stevenson and Ezekiel Elliott each had a touchdown and had a pretty similar workload. This has trended pretty confusingly, not in favor of Zeke, but less in favor of Ramondre than I think most people would have expected with how tremendously successful he was in that first season. And Zeke looking pretty good. But another note in that Patriots team, you did have Malik Cunningham. He is the rookie quarterback out of Louisville. Throughout the the offseason, preseason, he was utilized very much in an Edelman type role. He was used in special teams. He was used as a wide receiver, something he hadn't done. And I was very curious. I sincerely believe that he was kind of following that trajectory of that Julian Edelman role, where again, a tremendous athlete, a good quarterback as well in his own right. But he really seemed to be just buying into, as we hear, the Patriot way, and just doing anything he's asked to do. And he was actually slotted in as the QB2 in the depth chart for this game. So I don't think Mac Jones has done anything to really inspire hope in Belichick or the Patriots as a whole. So curious to see if Malik Cunningham actually gets a chance, if he's only brought in there as a type of, a sincere backup to Mac, but also just as a trick play kind of guy. Curious to see. And jumping over to the Raiders now, 3-3. Jimmy G did leave with an injury, but should be okay. And Michael Mayer really grown into a pretty tremendous role. I feel like from the beginning of this season, going into like with the draft process and everything, he was thought of to be a pretty complete tight end prospect. And then I think was, going into the season, the Raiders didn't really have much to speak of necessarily. And then you go ahead and you have him finally getting his chance to produce. 5 receptions, 75 yards, leading the team with yards. Davante Adams, though, 2 receptions and 29 yards. So don't know if we're chalking that up to the different quarterback and Brian Hoyer stepping in there or what, but that was a tough look. And I think Davante Adams had mentioned talking about the losing being pretty frustrating. So again, they did win in this one, but he's certainly not in Green Bay anymore. Jumping over to the next game, the Lions beating the Buccaneers 20-8. So the Lions climbing to 5-1 at this point. Goff continues a tremendous season. Over 350 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. Tough sledding, though. David Montgomery getting injured. Could be out for a couple of weeks there. Craig Reynolds leading the team with 15 rushing yards. And I did say 15, not 50. 15. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 12 receptions, 124 yards, 1 touchdown. It doesn't matter if it's PPR, it's standard, it's whatever. Good for him. He's serving you well. And Jameson Williams, JMO, as he's also known, 2 receptions. That looks familiar. But what doesn't look familiar is 53 yards and a touchdown. So maybe looking to get back to his Alabama days as a deep threat and hoping that he can be that for that team. You've got Sam LaPorta, who on the season is the tight end 1, and we'll talk about here a little bit later. And you've got Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's battled injury a little bit. David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, who was injured this game. So, again, plenty of weapons, certainly, but you hope they all come back healthy, and this team is going to be a real threat to get to the big dance. Buccaneers falling to 3-2. Of course, they've already had a bye week, and Baker Mayfield, not too inspiring thus far. In this game. Thus far, he's actually done reasonably well, I think, for fantasy for what most people expected. But this week, no touchdowns, threw a pick, and also got injured. We'll see if he's going to be out. Overall, the offense was not tremendously inspiring, of course, only scoring 8 points. Not much to take away from that. Jumping over to the next game, the Cardinals falling to the Rams 9-26. Cardinals are 1-5, but I will say, at least for fantasy's sake, Josh Dobbs has been a revelation when it comes to someone coming in at the absolute last second and has started for the team since and has done pretty well. Again, for fantasy's sake, not for real NFL sake, because they are 1-5. But Dobbs did step in, 1 interception, no touchdowns, but did lead the team in rushing with 47 yards. And the receiving leaders, we got Trey McBride and Michael Wilson, both co-leading with 62 yards. And the LA Rams, 3-3, got the win. But the tough part here is Kyren Williams, the stud out of nowhere. He was the guy left in the backfield after it was Cam Akers going, getting 158 yards and 1 touchdown. He went down with an injury. Ronnie Rivers went down with an injury as well. Next guy up is Zach Evans. So going forward, curious to see what they're going to do Again, they still need to add depth to that backfield regardless, but is it Zach Evans' chance to shine? Cooper Kupp continues to be solid. This is his second game back. 7 receptions, 148 yards, and a touchdown. Puka doing okay. 4 receptions, 26 yards, not as inspiring as last week's. But I think when you look at his targets in the 2 weeks since, there's no way he could have kept up the target share, certainly that he had in the first 2 weeks. But with Cooper Kupp coming back, I think Puka has shown that he's still a trusted target to Stafford, but nobody's Cooper Kupp. We know that. Next up, and this is the second to last one, we'll be talking about the Eagles going down to the Jets, 14-20. That is the first loss for the Eagles on the season. So it's the 49ers and the Eagles getting their first losses. 4 turnovers by the Eagles, 3 interceptions by Hurts, very uncharacteristic. You have Lane Johnson leaving the game early with an injury. Hopefully he's not out too long. As we know, Philly's O-line is one of their strengths as one of the best in the NFL. And Hurts also did actually lead the team in rushing, very Dobbs-like, if you will, with 47 yards. DeAndre Swift, I think he had a mere 18 rushing yards, but did save his poor rushing attack with 8 catches and a touchdown. And A.J. Brown eclipsing 100 yards. Jets climbing to 3-3. The Zach Wilson-led Jets. Didn't have a touchdown, but didn't have an interception. And you have Breece Hall. He was saved by a touchdown and 5 receptions, so a bit similar to Swift in terms of a PPR mindset, getting to have that in there. You also have Garrett Wilson, 8 receptions, 90 yards. And you have Greg the Leg Zuerlein, 4 of 4. Putting up the absolute points to help push the Jets past the Eagles. Love to see it. Big kicker fan here. And the final game to talk about, as I mentioned, the Cowboys and Chargers game is going on at this moment. The Giants falling to the Bills 9-14. The Giants 1-5. This was Tyrod Taylor, or Tyrod. Again, fellow Virginia Tech alumni, but I still don't remember how you say his first name. And led them reasonably well. Didn't get a chance to watch all of this game. I think there was a couple of Dable was, I think, a little disgruntled at certain points. But you have Saquon getting 28 total touches, his first game back healthy in a number of weeks. And Wan'Dale Robinson, he's back. I think this is his 3rd game back, being healthy, 8 receptions. He really is getting a lot of opportunity in that wide receiver room. And one that I thought was going to be dominated by Isaiah Hodgins and Paris Campbell. Initially, it was Paris Campbell. Now it seems like it's more Wan'Dale Robinson and Darius Slayton. Of course, Darren Waller is, of course, involved in that. Jumping over to the Bills, 4-2. Josh Allen, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. His favorite guy to throw to, Stephon Diggs, 100 yards. James Cook, 71 yards. And another big note, Damian Harris leaving the game with an injury. Reportedly okay. I don't know what that means in terms of his upcoming availability or going forward, but seemingly okay. Hoping for the best. As I mentioned, the Cowboys and Chargers game is going on as we speak, but I will jump over to some of my biggest surprises for this season. So biggest surprises thus far, we're through week 6, almost. We do have the Cowboys game going on right now, but the biggest surprise, who played better than I thought they would at quarterback, is C.J. Stroud. So currently he's sitting at QB 13. He's made Nico Collins a top 12 wide receiver. At this point, he's on pace to eclipse 4,700 yards and 25 touchdowns. And to put that in reference, in 2022, Kirk Cousins was the QB 6, and that was at about 4,500 passing yards and 29 touchdowns. So giving you the idea that, certainly if Stroud keeps this up, he's a locked and loaded top 10 quarterback in fantasy, which for his rookie season in what many believed a very not inspiring offense, it's tremendous. And ironically enough, as I mentioned, the Cowboys and Chargers game going on, the one that surprised me for the worse was Dak Prescott. I know that Coach McCarthy had mentioned there was actually not going to be as much passing, going to be a bit more run heavy, and that was with Ezekiel Elliott leaving, and it was going to be run by Tony Pollard, Rico Dowdle, Malik Davis, Deuce Vaughn, an interesting mix of running backs there. And I mean, Desmond Ritter is outscoring him on a per game basis. And I know there's a bit more passing volume there with what he's doing, which is shocking because it's the Falcons and they have Bijan Robinson. And in terms of Dak Prescott's showing last week, week 5, throwing 3 picks against the 49ers, I mean, that game was an anomaly in terms of how far that just went the other way. But as I was looking into this week, this felt like the get right game for Dak. This is a Chargers defense that could be exposed with what they've been giving up based on fantasy points to quarterbacks in the back, bottom 5, I want to say. So hoping that Dak can get back after it. And at a minimum, this could be his highest scoring week thus far of the season. Jumping over to running back. So the biggest surprise, doing better than I thought they would, Raheem Mostert, the RB2 on the year, the 31-year-old stud of a running back in Raheem Mostert, coming over from the Shanahan system over in San Fran. He and Jeff Wilson joining Coach McDaniel, averaging 5.7 yards per carry. He already has 9 touchdowns. And Devon Achane, still practicing that one, possibly out until week 11, maybe a little bit later. We'll see. He is on the IR. And now with CMC possibly injured in terms of, we know he's injured, but will he miss any time? We don't know that yet. But could we have Raheem Mostert after this week, going forward? He's going to be the RB1 in fantasy. I mean, looking at this Dolphins offense, it's plausible. Even when Jeff Wilson comes back, there'd be a bit of balance there. But, between Mostert, Jeff Wilson, Salvin Ahmed, before Achane comes back, this is Raheem Mostert's backfield, and this offense is firing on all cylinders. So I love to see it. A running back that has surprised me for the worse, Javonte Williams. He was a guy in his rookie class. I actually had him over Travis Etienne in terms of his ability to, a pretty bruising back, a big back. But I think I saw him as pretty nimble and could do a bit of it all at UNC alongside Michael Carter and Sam Howell. Javonte Williams currently sits as the RB43. He has missed one full game and then, of course, was injured a couple games back with Jaleel McLaughlin and Samaje Perine stepping in relief. He has a points per game lower than Chuba Hubbard. And I do like Chuba Hubbard. Obviously, look at my wall. But Chuba's only gotten really one game to be the starter, which was this past game in week 6. Otherwise, he's been splitting time with Miles Sanders. And the fact that Chuba Hubbard has been that effective speaks well of him, but is not speaking too well of Javonte Williams, that despite being in a very uninspiring offense thus far, he has not produced to what I think we hoped. Despite coming off of an injury, I understand that. Does not have a touchdown on the season. And, with Jaleel McLaughlin, undrafted guy coming out, showing out, and I think providing a bit of a spark to this offense that, it's not really showing up in wins and losses necessarily, but from a fantasy standpoint, everyone, and certainly in a dynasty standpoint, everyone in their league is not able to have Jaleel McLaughlin on as a free agent at this point. Jumping over to the wide receivers, no shock here. Puka Nacua is the wide receiver 3 on the season. That's despite Cooper Kupp coming back over the last 2 weeks. He's in the ballpark of A.J. Brown when it comes to points per game. Pretty tremendous there. Since Kupp has returned, it was 11 targets last week and 7 targets this week, and averaging 12 targets on the season, just about. So week 6 was his lowest fantasy production, 6.6 points in PPR and more traditional scoring if there's bonuses or anything like that. But his role is pretty clear. He is second fiddle to Cooper Kupp. But I think what he's shown, certainly with Kupp's coming back, Kupp's going to get his. We know that. There's an established relationship there with he and Stafford. But, I mean, Puka Nacua, it's not for nothing. I know Higbee last season had one of his a career year in terms of really kind of being Stafford's guy. But Puka Nacua, I think, if someone sees this as the dip and the buy low, if that even exists for Puka at this point, please take it. But I don't know that anyone's necessarily going to be selling Puka anytime soon. The wide receiver who's been disappointing, surprising for the worse, Jahan Dotson. So again, I mentioned talking about Sam Howell, excited for his chance to be in that offense. offense led by Eric Bieniemy. I'm not expecting Sam Howell to be Patrick Mahomes, but I've been excited for the prospect of what that offense could look like. And Jahan Dotson sitting at wide receiver 63 on the year. Just a 1 target, 0 fantasy point outing against Atlanta in week 6. Don't love it. On the season, 17 receptions, 140 yards, and 1 touchdown. Not what we expected. Eric Bieniemy's coming in. He's spreading it out to everybody. Seeing between McLaurin, Curtis Samuel having a tremendous year, certainly for touchdowns as well. I think he has 3 or 4 at this point. And also, again, Logan Thomas, people joking about him being used like Travis Kelce. I think it was week 5. So overall, I like what the offense is looking like when it comes to being spread out a bit, but Sam Howell just getting sacked left and right. When it comes to utilizing all the weapons, it's certainly being done. But 7 touchdowns in his rookie year for Jahan Dotson, and it hasn't really quite all come together this year for him. And it can still turn around. I know it can, but hasn't looked great. And I'm sure for anyone, it could be a good buy low opportunity. I do actually own him in most of the dynasty leagues I'm in. Big fan of him, and certainly enjoyed the reception perception write up of him and believing in his ability. Last but not least, and don't worry, I'm almost done. The tight ends, we've got for the better, we got Sam LaPorta, tight end 1 on the season. Unbelievable. And it did help with Travis Kelce being out earlier, and of course, Mark Andrews being out earlier, as those are the only 2 other tight ends that on a per game basis are beating him in fantasy points per game. He's ahead of Hawkinson and everybody else, though. And he has had 2 11 target games, and he has 3 total touchdowns thus far. And just kind of looking ahead, probably a bit of a mix of a redraft and from a dynasty standpoint. From dynasty, I doubt you can afford him at this point if you don't have him already. But from a redraft perspective, if you're looking ahead to the playoffs, after week 13 when they're playing the Saints, a lot of friendly tight end matchups for Sam LaPorta. So I assume he's already gobbled up in whatever format league you have. But if there's any chance that you can get him, especially if you need somebody this year and going forward, but in the playoffs this year, he'd be very helpful. And so surprising me for the worse, his rookie counterpart, and Dalton Kincaid, the long-believed best tight end in this class. Plenty of time for that. It can definitely still happen. I don't think it's going to, if I'm being honest. He is being, you can say underutilized. I think a lot of people did believe that he was going to be used almost like a slot receiver, something that the Buffalo Bills have loved to do, whether it be Cole Beasley, Jamison Crowder. They've loved to get their slot guys ample volume outside of Stephon Diggs getting his tremendous number of targets and Gabe Davis getting his deep targets. But Dalton Kincaid on the year, tight end 23, about 4 targets per game, nothing too tremendous. His usage has been, at least in terms of targets and receptions and such, pretty comparable to what Dawson Knox has been getting. And his Kincaid's production has actually been behind another rookie in Luke Musgrave over in Green Bay. So the offense does very much still flow through Stephon Diggs and to some degree Gabe Davis as well. Well, that wraps it up for this week's episode of the Father Dynasty Podcast. Really want to give another shout out to those Dynasty Daddies, my buddy Tyler and Trevor. Very excited for them having their Tyler's second and Trevor's first. And shout out to all those Dynasty Daddies out there. Stay classic.